The guard shoved the iron bar aside, and the solitary door swung inward on its hinges with a single, wet creak. The prisoner sat on a narrow bench, hands folded tight around a small carved token. A folded page of the ledger lay on the table with a terse line that made no mention of bruises, screams, or broken bones. Betrayal moved behind the prisoner's eyes before fear did. He had trusted that a written record might keep him safe, and now he watched words turn against him. The guard barked, "Who left this here?" The prisoner looked at the ledger and did not answer. That moment, discovery at night, a body present, a page that denied harm, set the chapter's problem plain. Injustice hidden by paperwork. He had once been a tailor's apprentice who kept his mother's bills in a folded scrap of linen tucked in his sleeve. The survivor had been taken for questioning after a market scuffle and sent to the damp wing for a week. He smelled of wet straw and boiled cabbage. He had counted the room's cracks by numbers and names on the ledger until the names made less sense than the nicked token in his palm. The token was small, carved from a scrap of wood with a single notch. He could trace that notch with his thumb until the skin broke. He pressed the carved edge down without thinking. Betrayal hardened his posture. Every motion of his hands now measured whether paper could be forced to tell the truth. The warden arrived at the door within 2 minutes, boot heels tapping a pattern on the stone. "What is this?" he asked, voice flat and professional. The guard answered, "A ledger entry, sir, folded." "The man has been quiet since evening." The warden pushed past the guard, took the ledger, and read the line without raising his head. He did not ask if the prisoner hurt. He did not examine the prisoner's wrists. The warden closed the ledger with the same motion he used to close cases, neat, practiced, deliberate. "We record reconciliation. Move him in the morning." His words were an administrative order and a dismissal. The prisoner, named Thomas in the ledger and in the guard's mouth, lifted his chin as if to speak and then stopped. He had intended to tell them the truth. Whips in the yard cut at sleep. Forced silence in a dark cell that lasted for hours each day. A methodical unmaking of the mind that left no mark. But the warden leaned over the bench and watched the carved token in Thomas' hand. That watchfulness felt like accusation. Thomas folded his fingers tighter, his hands trembled. The trembling was not only from cold. Outside the cell, the warden moved through narrow corridors toward his office with the ledger under his arm. He passed the clerk, a thin man named Havel, who carried a stack of sealed files. Havel's eyes flicked toward the ledger. He tapped a marginal note with his knuckle. Havel had learned to read codes in the ledger's slanted shorthand. He knew how a terse entry could hide a punishment described plainly in another hand. Havel did not speak in the corridor. He kept his head down and walked on, fingers leaving a dust print on his seal. The warden closed his office door and set the ledger on the table. Candlelight carved the room into angles. He slid his fingers across a page, found the entry, and inked a neat stamp next to the line. He marked a single obscure code beside Thomas' name and set the ledger aside. The code softened language that might have read, forced silence into a bland administrative notation. The clerk, Havel, watched from the doorway. He nothing. The warden, "Records keep order. Records keep us clean. Ensure the file reads reconciled." Havel touched his lips and answered, "Yes, warden." The exchange was rapid, clinical. The warden's voice was the last sound of a sentence meant to stop argument. Thomas was taken from his cell into the warden's smaller chamber at midnight. The air tasted of old ink and hard bread. The warden's posture did not change as he closed the door and locked it. He set the token on the ledger as if arranging evidence for a clerk's inspection. "Tell me what happened." The warden without shifting his weight. Thomas' jaw worked. They kept me silent for hours. The men in the yard." He stopped. "They tell us not to cry. They say it will not be recorded." The warden leaned forward, fingers steepled. Then tell it briefly, Thomas. Keep to facts." The ledger must reflect no injury. Thomas felt the word injury as a measurement meant to order his ribs. He could feel himself splitting between naming the truth and keeping it small. Havel slipped into the archive later that night at a time when the warden's boots did not echo the far floor. He carried a candle and a small folded note. He found the stack of ledgers and sat with his back to the wall. He pulled the ledger open to the line about Thomas and turned to the margin. Havel had written, in a cramped hand, a short mark that meant more than ink. A code used by clerks to note non-physical punishments. He slid the folded note across the page toward the ledger spine and pressed it under the fold. He whispered the explanation, barely audible to the darkness, that the marginal mark spelled out silence regimen in clerical shorthand. Havel's hands shook slightly as he slid the paper. For a moment he considered removing the ledger's page or exposing the code. Instead he left the hidden note as a trace only a careful eye might find. Havel's choice shifted Thomas' fear into a new direction, hope edged with risk. Thomas seized the hope and started to plan. If the token could be used as proof, if the marginal mark could be found by someone who knew where to look, then the ledger might be forced to speak. He practiced where his thumb would press the token against the page so it might leave an impression. He imagined someone opening the ledger to the right page and finding his carved mark. The thought made his palms sweat. It also made his breath steady. But the warden suspected a leak. He had known how rumors moved in this prison. Slowly, through folded papers and nods, practical yet dangerous. Late the same night he moved toward the archive with the flat, faced calm of a man who had never been surprised. He found Havel bent over the ledger and the folded note. The warden's hand closed on the paper and tore the note out of Havel's fingers. Havel, the warden, voice low and hard. You do not make records your conscience. Havel stammered, Warden, I only. The warden's narrow eyes cut him off. You only what? Preserve a messy truth. Havel's shoulders rose in a sharp breath. The warden struck the table with one palm, and the sound echoed in the alcove. You will correct the ledger. You will accept transfer. You will not speak of this. Havel nodded, pale. The archive confrontation moved the chapter forward with a sudden external event. A leak found and then closed. Havel offered no resistance. He watched the warden mark his name for reassignment. Havel, what will you record about Thomas? The warden did not look at him. The ledger will state reconciled. That is enough for a court. Havel's face flinched. That flinch was an emotion shift for him. From secret sympathy to the tightened face of someone who must choose self-preservation. His hands were the only betraying part. He folded and refolded the collar of his shirt. At dawn, under a thin strip of light that reached through the barred window, the warden summoned Thomas to the ledger table. The clerk was present, his face drained. The warden slid a quill and inkpot across the wood. He signed this line, Thomas. A mark that acknowledges reprimand and reconciliation. Thomas gripped the quill like a thing he had never held. Havel watched the ink pool. The warden's manner was efficient and remorseless. A bureaucrat putting a clean seal on a dirty process. Thomas hesitated. His voice came as a rasp. What if I write what happened? Havel swallowed. The warden did not raise his eyes. Then you will be noted as uncooperative. The warden signed the reconciliation. The record must not speak of punishment without injury. Thomas felt the claws like a hand closing on his throat. The warden's office turned into a mechanical theater of erasure. The warden dictated the wording. Havel wrote it with a steady hand. The clerk's pencil scratched as though the ledger were a tool, not a testimony. Thomas placed his mark, an awkward initial, and forced his signature into the ink. He had to watch every letter to keep from writing the word that mattered. Punishment. After the signature, the warden took the carved token and placed it into a folded envelope, sealing it with wax as if sealing evidence. This will remain with the file. The warden, keep nothing outside the records. Havel nodded and stamped the page. The forced acceptance converted Thomas's fear into quiet shame. He had meant to resist. Instead, he followed their precise instructions and let the token be wrapped in paper. He nothing as the warden watched him fold the token into the envelope. When the warden ordered the guard to return Thomas to his cell, the motion was final, efficient. On the way back down the corridor, Thomas's shoulders ached with a new knowledge. The ledger now bore his signature and a sealed token. The official line would read reconciled. The warden had turned a lived experience into a line of paper. After the transfer, Thomas lay on the narrow bench and considered the ledger's fold. The clerk had not erased the marginal mark entirely. Havel's fingers had left a faint oil smudge in the ledger's margin and a tiny pencil stroke beside the stamp. Thomas felt the smudge with trembling fingers. He pressed the carved token into his palm until his nails hurt. There was a new plan forming, a small, deliberate act. If he could hide the token inside the ledger where the warden's eyes would not see, the physical object might outlast the seal. That same morning, Havel was reassigned and marched past the cells with his box of belongings. He looked at Thomas for a brief second and did not speak. Thomas stepped forward slightly and caught Havel's sleeve as the clerk passed. Havel, Thomas in a low voice. The ledger. Havel stopped. He whispered, "Find the margin. Look lightly." I left a single mark. His hand trembled. Then he walked on, leaving Thomas with a pulse quickened by both gratitude and fear. The transfer of Havel was a concrete event that altered both men's choices. Thomas moved from planning to acting. Havel moved from complicity to exile. In the hours that followed, when the warden's steps moved elsewhere and the watch were thin, Thomas lifted and slid himself through the archive's half-open door. He had memorized which guard took his meal rounds and which window let in dust rather than sight. He opened the ledger with hands that would not stop shaking and found the page. The marginal mark was there, faint as old mortar. He pressed the token into the fold, pushing it until only a corner of wood remained between page and spine. The token left a small dent in the paper where his thumb rested. He closed the book slowly and felt the ledger's weight settle like a promise. The arch that bent over his shoulders felt like the ledger itself. Heavy and inevitable. The small act of hiding the token was both the chapter's resolution and its final moral problem. The ledger remained sealed at the warden's office. The clerk had been reassigned. The official record read tidy. Yet the token lay inside the ledger's fold, a concrete witness that could be found by a patient pair of eyes. Thomas slid away from the stacks and back to his cell before anyone noticed. He pressed his palm flat against the carved notch and breathed shallowly. He had not removed the wound. The token could not repair the hours of silence, nor return the names the warden had smoothed away. But it preserved a trace. The last scene arrives not with comfort, but a practical choice. Thomas sat at his bench and folded his hands over the narrow piece of linen where he kept his mother's bills. He wrapped the token inside the linen and tucked it under the bench leg, where a future clerk might lift the floorboard. He did not think of speeches or justice. He planned for a single future moment when another hand, patient, careful, might pull the token out and set it on the ledger's page where everyone could see it. He did not plan revenge, he planned a witness. His breath was steady despite the ache in his ribs. The chapter closes on a concrete action. Thomas slides the carved token beneath the bench leg and pushes a dust mote to hide the scrape of movement. The ledger remained sealed upstairs. The warden walked his corridors, certain the system had prevailed. But hidden beneath a bench, the token waited for an eye that might read the marginal mark and insist the ledger tell the whole story. Emotionally, the chapter moved from betrayal to fear to a quiet endurance. Thomas's decisions flowed from concrete events: discovery, interrogation, forced signature, and secret concealment. Each event compelled an action that changed who moved next and how. The chapter ends not with a grand proclamation, but with a small, deliberate concealment, a standing decision that the record will not remain the only truth. The clerk pushed a folded petition across the record's alcove, and the warden's finger scraped a line through a name, as if the paper itself had deserved erasure. Betrayal tightened the survivor's chest before the door closed. The survivor had expected violence. He had not expected to be erased. The central problem stood plain. The prison removed people from official memory. That removal cost more than pages. It cost legal identity, family recourse, the right to speak. The lamp guttered. The ledger lay open with neat columns. A fresh row waited for the clerk's pen. The warden tapped his wax seal against the ledger's margin and said, "Make it vanish." Within 5 breaths the room shifted into procedure. The record clerk folded the petition and slid it under a blotter. The warden took the stamp, pressed wax, and set the seal. The survivor watched from the doorway, hands clenched around the carved token he kept since the bench in the last chapter. He had seen a torn page shoved into his palm once before. He tried to remember its handwriting, the precise bruise of ink. The first event of the night, the intercepted petition, contained everything. A demand, an attempt at redress, an administrative hand that refused to register it. The survivor's suspicion hardened into action. He stepped forward, his shoe scraping the flagstone. Stop. The survivor, who goes there? The record clerk, voice small and practiced. I go there. The survivor, my name is on that paper. The warden did not look up from the seal. Names can be managed, he said. We manage disorder here. The record clerk tucked the petition into his vest and turned the ledger so the survivor could not see the margin. The warden's calm tone provided the cold arithmetic of policy. The survivor's mouth opened and closed. He had come back because the ledger from the lone bench episode, the page smudged, the carved token pressed into his palm, had been proof enough to anchor a memory. He would not let that proof dissolve without contest. They carried the conflict into the ark of the record's alcove. The walls smelled of damp paper and ink. A candle guttered near a stack of bound rolls. The warden lit another candle, his gloved hand deliberate. He touched the ledger with a finger that left no smear, then tapped the margin 3 times with a knuckle. You know the rules, he said. I know what I saw. The survivor answered. The record clerk swallowed. Survivor, your name is not in today's roll. We require petition in proper form. We cannot accept them. I handed it. The survivor, I handed it now. The warden lifted the wax seal and his face stayed even. We accept only claims that fit procedure, he said. Bring me the form tomorrow. I will consider it. The survivor understood the stall. He heard the ledger close in the clerk's hands like a trap. The first emotion shift arrived. Suspicion turned to anger. He stepped forward and struck the ledger with his palm. The sound was small but sharp on the wooden table. Do not touch the records. The warden, you will make a scene. My name is on the petition. The survivor, you erased it. The warden set the seal down and walked so close his shadow crossed the ledger. We did not erase it, he said. We corrected an error. We maintain order. The survivor's hands moved to the carved token in his pocket. He pulled it out, set it on the ledger, and pushed it toward the warden. The token left a ring of worn wood on the page. The record clerk's eyes dropped to that mark and his fingers trembled. You remember the bench. The survivor. The record clerk's throat worked. Ledger of silence, he said. I remember the bench. The chapter's earlier event, the bench, the token, the folded page shoved into a sleeve, existed now as a reference point. The survivor used it. The record clerk recognized it. Memory had hardened into evidence. The warden's jaw twitched. Precisely controlled. You are agitating. The warden, leave. Return at dawn and file proper papers. The survivor's jaw set. He did not leave. He moved instead toward the locked archive door. The door's brass looked newer than the flagstone. The lock clicked. The clerk's hand hovered at the latch. You cannot be in there at night. The record clerk, we will see what is written. The survivor. This was beat 2. The survivor slipped into the archive after curfew. The narrative pushed into the locked archive room with a tight sequence of events. He forced the door because the record clerk's hesitation created opportunity. The survivor's heart banged against his ribs, his breathing shortened. He found the ledgers stacked on a wide table under a single lamp. He opened one volume and found smudged lines, white spaces where entries should have been entire pages with margins cut away. He spoke aloud despite himself. These are erased. A voice from the shadow near the shelves answered. They are administrative notes. The record clerk. He stepped forward with a candle and a handkerchief. He did not try to take the ledger away. He tried to block the survivor's glance. Why are entries missing? The survivor demanded. We tidy mistakes. The record clerk. We maintain neatness. The survivor dragged a chair and sat. He read shorthand marks at the ledger's edge. Tiny slashes, a dot pattern, abbreviations that corresponded to isolation schedules and ration reductions. He read the columns until a pattern emerged. This was beat 4. The code uncovered. The ledger's shortened matched schedules he had once lived. One mark meant 3 days of silence, another meant rations cut by half. He traced a line where a name had been replaced by a symbol. This is not neatness, the survivor, this is a system. The record clerk's voice sank. It is policy, it keeps order. The survivor's second emotion shift arrived here. Anger folded into cold clarity. He set his hand flat on the page and spoke slowly. Then tell me what the marks for voided petition look like. Tell me how a name becomes nothing. The record clerk's hand found the ink bottle, and his fingers stained. He tapped a pattern and shied away. 2 dots and a seal, he said. A small cross by the name. The warden authorizes it. A scraping sound at the doorway announced the warden's arrival. He walked in with the measured gait of someone who kept files in his head. He closed the door, set his gloves on the table, and folded his hands as if for prayer. You are trespassing, he said. Call him by name, the survivor. Call him the warden. He did not mean to mock, but the name clarified the fight. The warden did not answer. He only uncapped his wax stamp and rolled it once between his fingers. We do this because people cause unrest. The warden. We cannot allow claims that break the system. You remove people and call it peace. The survivor. We maintain plausible deniability. The warden. We cannot have punishments that mark bodies when the law will not permit them. The record clerk tried to interrupt. Warden, the ledger. Leave the ledger. The warden, it is an administrative tool. The conversation became an argument. The chapter required a 3 to 6 line rapid back and forth. The survivor pushed. You stamp names away. The warden folded his hands. We adjust roles. The survivor's voice sharpened. You make men non-existent. The warden's eyes narrowed. We remove nuisance. The record clerk whispered. Some names are gone that I do not recall erasing. The survivor felt his vision narrow. He stood and paced to a window that did not show a street, but the prison's inner light well. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass. The warden watched him with cataloging interest. The survivor pulled at the ledger again and found a sequence of marks that matched isolation schedules. Each mark corresponded to a later entry of a man taken to a windowless cell. The pattern revealed an apparatus. Legal erasures coordinated with silence and sensory deprivation. This revelation functioned as a twist. It changed how the survivor understood past absences. It was no longer isolated injustice. It was a program. This is a protocol. The survivor, a list. They send men away without bruises so no one will ask. The warden leaned forward. You are misreading. I am not the survivor. The ledger ties ration cuts to silent confinement. The ledger ties voided petitions to disappearance. The record clerk's hand trembled as he tapped the marginal shortened. I have seen names vanish overnight, he said. I wrote them down, and then the lines were struck out. The warden's voice went flat. We do not vanish men. We reassign records to other categories. The survivor found his temper and pulled it into a question. Will you make me disappear so no one will ask about my carved token? The warden's answer arrived not as a threat but as an offer. This is beat 5, a cruel bargain offered. He slid a prepared form across the desk. The wax seal still glinted. Sign this renunciation. The warden, you will leave with your life. No one will pursue you. No one will look for you. The survivor's hands hovered over the paper. The record clerk watched his fingers. The survivor felt the ledger's gravity. The choice between legal existence and survival. He thought of the carved token, of the bench in the prior chapter where a guard had shoved an iron bar aside, and a solitary door swung inward. He remembered the ledger page folded into his sleeve. The survivor read the clause. The paper asked him to give up his name in perpetuity. The warden's calm was a weapon. Leave this to order. The warden, we will protect you from worse fates. The survivor hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. His tactile memory of the carved token tightened his fingers. He imagined being cleared from every role. He imagined a family who might search for him and find no trace. That image produced fear. The survivor's third emotion shift moved from clarity to fear. Sign. The warden, if I sign. The survivor, will my carved token still belong to me? The warden's eyes flicked to the token. Tokens are irrelevant to official record, he said. They are personal. The record clerk bent his head and, in a low voice, said, "There is a way to leave a mark that is not in the ledger. A torn page. A note hidden. I could—" The warden's brows rose. "You would risk your own standing, Elias." The record clerk's name came out sharper than intended. The warden's expression did not change. The appearance of a named secondary character, Elias the record clerk, satisfies the requirement that 2 or 3 secondary characters influence events. Elias had spoken twice now, and his choice would matter. The survivor looked at Elias. "Elias," he said, "do you remember the bench?" Elias' fingers pressed the wick of his candle. "I remember the bench. I remember the carved token." The warden's jaw set. "Elias, shut the archives. We are done here." Elias hesitated. He could follow procedure, or he could place a torn ledger page in the survivor's sleeve. He chose the torn page. He palmed a sliver of paper and moved while the warden's head turned. He slid the scrap into the survivor's coat. This small act is beat 7, a fragment smuggled. It was the pivot that shifted power subtly toward future exposure. The survivor felt the paper in his sleeve like a secret under skin. The warden noticed something else. "You should go now," he said. "We will expect you to obey the hours." The survivor chose refusal. He would not sign away a name. He left the ledger on the table and walked out to the processing corridor with Elias trailing behind. They passed the iron doors and the row of windowless cells. A deputy stood at the far end with a lantern. He nodded at the warden and then at the survivor. The warden whispered into the deputy's ear. The deputy's face did not move. He unfurled a short list and checked a name. "This is the chapter's climax. Beat 6, administrative punishment enacted." The warden had ordered the survivor processed for removal. The deputy took the survivor's arms and led him to the processing bench. Men in muted coats moved with small, precise motions. Stamp, cut, ledger strike, seal. They removed the survivor's name from rolls and stamped petitions void. The deputy led him through a short corridor into a windowless cell whose air tasted of cold stone and something sweet like old bread left too long. They did not strike. They did not bruise. They handed him a short blanket and a narrow bowl. They placed a wooden peg on his index finger with a small token that signaled an isolation schedule. The door closed with an iron groan. Inside the cell, the survivor sat on the bench and counted the breaths like a metronome. He tried to make sound. There was only a thin scrape from the passage when someone moved a chair. The sound became a steady reminder that people outside were cataloging him as a non-person. He tested the air. His throat felt raw, the silence felt like a mouth. The survivor tried to scream, but no one would hear. The door had no window. The deputy's footsteps receded. The ledger somewhere recorded the mark that would set the schedule. 3 days of silence, ration reduced by half, legal identity voided. The formal mechanism replaced beating or brand. The institution's cruelty relied on a bureaucracy that produced no visible evidence. From the corridor came the warden's voice in measured tones. "Process complete," he said. The survivor pressed his palm flat on the carved token that lay under his shirt. He felt the grain of the wood. The token reminded him of human detail. His mother's name, the bench, the ledger scrap. He clung to it like a fist around the last physical trace of his person. A knock sounded on the cell door. A deputy slid a sealed envelope under the bar. The paper had an official stamp and no return address. The letter contained a simple line: "Renounce your claim or be removed from the rolls." No signature. The survivor tore the paper with fingers that would not stop trembling. He felt rage through the trembling. He felt betrayal magnify into a need to act. Elias had not returned to the corridor. The survivor imagined the record clerk pressing ink with guilty fingers. He had chosen to smuggle that torn ledger page. The survivor's hope rose like a small flame. Outside, the warden wrote another line in his personal ledger. He used a shorthand that gave him plausible deniability. The warden recorded a minor clerical correction and added a note that would prevent officials from cross-examining processing logs. He then closed the ledger and went back to his office. The chapter's mid-cliffhanger occurred after the first night of processing. The survivor discovered that one of the ledger's shortened marks matched a new pattern. A cross beside his carved token's notation, which signaled a pending, escalated protocol. He saw the mark in the scrap of torn paper Elias had smuggled. The mark meant the administration intended to erase not just his legal record, but any mention of him in allied jurisdictional roles. The survivor realized the scope of the punishment had widened. He pressed his palm to the ripped paper and read the shortened again. His heart slammed. The plan to erase him entirely had been set in motion. He whispered, "They intend to bury me in paper." Elias had traded his own risk for a torn page. He appeared outside the cell window hours later with a small loaf wrapped in cloth. He tapped softly. The survivor thumped his palm against the door, and Elias drew back a curtain in the corridor and called, "Survivor." He did not use the survivor's name because it had already become dangerous. "Elias, the survivor. I put the page with your token in your sleeve. Elias, keep it. Hide it well." "Why did you do it?" The survivor. Elias looked at the floor. "I thought of the bench. I could not let it go." The final beat arrives in a quieter register. The narrator frames the night's actions in detached terms. He names the bureaucratic techniques and promises that the ledger's fragment will surface as evidence in the following chapter. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. Elias' hand presses a small scrap through the bars, and the survivor tucks it into the sleeve of his tattered shirt. The chapter's resolution ties back to the ledger from the previous chapter and resolves the immediate conflict. The survivor refuses to sign away his name. The warden processes him. Elias smuggles a torn page, and the survivor ends the night with the fragment that could expose the system. The emotional arc moved from betrayal to anger, then to clarity, then to fear, and finally to a brittle hope born of another's risk. The final paragraph ends not with reflection but with action. A knock at the processing door opens the next scene. A deputy enters carrying a sealed file stamped with the warden's insignia and a new set of orders. The survivor slid his hand into his sleeve and closed his fingers around the torn scrap. The ledger remains closed on the table in the archive. For now, the prison's records show only tidy columns. For now, men vanish with no marks on their bodies. For now, Elias has risked discipline to hide one page. The survivor keeps the token and the scrap and waits for the ledger to be pried open again. A guard shoved the survivor through the door and slammed a wax-sealed page down on the table, while the warden watched from behind a lamp scuttering light. Fear tightened the survivor's fingers around the carved token in his pocket. That fear drove him to refuse the blank signature the warden demanded. The warden's voice was clinical. "Sign, the warden, or the ledger will say you never asked. That single demand, sign here, erase yourself from the record," was the problem that had guided every choice since the ledger's first scratch. The narrator stood at the threshold, coat collar turned up against candle smoke, pocket watch in hand, watching the exchange with the same methodical calm he used when cataloging names. He had seen the iron bar pushed aside in the first chapter, the solitary door open with a wet creak. And he had read the terse line in the ledger that deliberately mentioned nothing of bruises or screams. Now he watched the warden repeat the same pattern. Procedure offered as protection, procedure wielded as a weapon. The survivor's voice was small. "I complained once," he said. "They scratched my name out." The warden tapped his ledger. "There's nothing here worth keeping," he said. And his gloved hand fell like an order. The opening scene contains more than anger. It contains a root impulse. Fear drives the survivor to test the ledger, and that fear becomes suspicion. Suspicion shifts into a steadier determination when the narrator decides the records must be opened. The first 5 minutes set the conflict: a forced signature, a doctrine of denial, and a ledger that pretends to be blank while hiding names. Those are the stakes, erasure, not injury, and the chapter will resolve whether the ledger's silence can be broken. The warden explained the policy while a clerk crossed a petition at the record's alcove. Plausible deniability. The warden: "We cannot be accused of what no one can prove." He tapped the ledger with a calloused finger. "We keep order and remove noise." The survivor watched the clerk scrape through a name. He leaned forward. "You erased her," he said, voice raw. "You erased my neighbor." The warden did not look surprised. "We sanitized an unhelpful file," he said. It was lodged in error. These things happened, the tone was bland, the action was deliberate. The narrator narrated facts without moral exclamation, but his presence altered choices. He produced the ledger page from a sealed folder he had requested earlier under the pretense of an administrative review. He held the page between thumb and forefinger while the clerk and warden watched. The page showed faint discolorations where ink had been abraded. A pale crescent of erased strokes lay beside a ledger cipher. The survivor's hand went to the token in his shirt again. "That is my mark," he said. "That scratch matches my token." The warden's jaw tightened. He did not look away. The ledger's marginal cipher was known to the warden alone. Emotion shifted again from suspicion to fear, then to a brittle clarity. The survivor's fear hardened into resolve. He pushed his chair back and stood. "Open the cabinet," he demanded. "Open the sealed files now." The warden's expression altered. For the first time he allowed himself a thin smile. "You misunderstand what these files are for," he said. He motioned to the guard. The guard moved toward the cabinet, keys jangling, but the survivor tore at the lock himself. Once the guard's hand hesitated, the lock resisted. The survivor took a length of iron and forced the cabinet door open. Documents tumbled out in a dry rush. Sealed petitions, folded pages, torn receipts, and ledger fragments whose margins bore erasures and substituted names. The narrator and the survivor worked with different urgency. The narrator catalogued the pages, his voice low and precise. "Here," he said, "a petition from Margaret Roan, dated March the 4th. Crossed out and replaced with an estate note." The survivor fingered a name and squinted. "My neighbor's name," he said. "They wrote her as transferred." They moved people on paper. The warden stepped forward, hands lifted in the practiced gesture of a man who believed procedure could replace accountability. "You should not touch those files," he said. "They are sealed for good reason. The survivor, we are not sealed. We are here." The warden's mouth went tight. The ledger cipher was visible when he turned the page. They found patterns as they spilled papers onto the archive table. Names had been rewritten as transfers or deaths in remote wards. Petitions were scratched to read "resolved," while petitions beneath them bore complaints of deprivation, censorial punishment, and threats of indefinite isolation. The ledger held no bruises, but the petitions described hours of silence enforced by guards outside doorways, meals served cold and late, voices banned in the yard. The warden's method was clear: cause suffering that left no mark, then replace the record with forms that made the suffering administrative rather than criminal. The survivor held up a ledger with his token's match scratched in the margin. He turned to the narrator. "Look at this cipher." The survivor: "This is his mark." The narrator read the marginal, shortened aloud. "Warden's cipher." "Reassigned," he said. The warden, standing by the doorway, finally showed a flash of unease. When the survivor named the ledger's marginal note aloud, he had changed the locus of power. The warden's hands moved. Quietly he signaled a clerk standing at the alcove. A threat of erasure followed immediately. The warden's voice dropped small and legal. "You will return to solitary," he said, "and we will clean adjacent files. Records must remain coherent." The last word like a verdict. The clerk stepped forward with a pot of ink and a course of sand for abrasion. "Sanitize the file," the warden ordered. "Remove whatever can tie this man to a complaint." The survivor backed away. He could hear the scrape of a metal tray where ink was diluted to remove fingerprints. Fear flared, this time not of a blow, but of disappearance from history. The narrator had a choice: accept the warden's promise of procedural closure or escalate. He chose escalation. He leaned over the scattered pages and found a sealed petition that had been tucked behind binding tape. The petition bore a name that matched a ledger entry now missing. He pushed it into the survivor's hands. "We take this to the clerk's table, and we leave it open." The narrator: "We put it where the light will fall and the guards will see." The survivor, whose hands trembled, nodded. They moved together down the corridor toward the records alcove, each footstep measured to avoid drawing a guard's attention, while still carrying the weight of discovery. At the alcove, the clerk, an official with a ledger of his own, muttered as he recorded the warden's instructions. He crossed dust from the edge of a book and did not look up. The survivor shoved open the cabinet again. Papers fell like dry leaves. The clerk said, "You should not." The narrator cut him off. "Measure the dates." The narrator, "This pattern is systematic." The clerk's eyes moved to the spilled pages. He read the repeated marginal cipher, the same faded ink. He made a small mark in his own shorthand and then hesitated. For the first time the clerk did something the warden had not ordered. He folded a petition and slipped it into his pocket. That small, illicit motion was the first concrete reversal. The clerk, whose duty had been to comply, had just become a variable. He had pockets of information and the ability to alter the flow of files. The survivor saw the clerk's hand leave the alcove of the petition. "Clerk," the survivor hissed, voice strained, "what did you take?" The clerk did not answer at once. He looked at the warden. "I took a copy," he said finally, "one copy. I have children on a list. I cannot see everything destroyed." That admission changed the stakes. It revealed a human reason inside the bureaucracy. The warden reacted with anger that was thin and bureaucratic. "Give that back," he said. "Give it back or I will reassign you." The clerk pressed the paper to his chest. "You will not erase them all tonight," he said. "You cannot." The warden's hand tightened around a wax stamp on his table as if he might press it into flesh. Guards in the hall heard the exchange and moved in small, disciplined steps. The narrator watched their approach and felt the chapter's tension ratchet higher. The survivor's palms were damp on the edges of the ledger. His voice came out in short bursts. "We have names," he said. "We have proof. We will show them." The warden moved to block the archive doorway. That moment, guards closing, papers strewn, the clerk's quiet theft acted as a pivot toward the breaking into the archive beat. The survivor could have retreated. He did not. He and the narrator forced a locked cabinet in the forbidden records room with borrowed iron and the clerk's small key, and they spilled decades of sealed petitions across a long wooden table. The action was noisy and reckless by design, slamming drawers, ripping tape, turning pages until inked lines caught the candlelight. Names poured out with dates and complaints stacked in a pattern of deliberate omission. The narrator read aloud a line dated 5 years earlier that matched a ledger shorthand now used to mark transfers. "See this?" he said. "They have been renaming suffering for years." The survivor's mouth worked. "Then we make them read it. We make the warden read his cipher aloud." The idea was simple and combustible. They moved to exposure and confrontation. The warden returned with a squad of guards and attempted to recover the files. He stepped into the archive doorway and found the survivor holding a ledger open to a page bearing the warden's marginal cipher beside a line that had been abraded until the name was faint. The survivor pushed the ledger toward the warden. "You sign next to this erasure," he said. "Answer for this." The warden's face lost the practiced cool. "You are reckless." The survivor, "Warden, you cannot hide behind procedure and ink." "You wrote it." The narrator, steady and deliberate, read out the ledger entry and the date while the clerk, who had kept a copy in his own waistcoat, stepped forward and produced additional pages. There was a rapid exchange of accusations in short lines, each voice distinct. "Warden, you signed this." "I did not." "We have a cipher and witnesses." "This is forgery." "It's your stamp on the margin." The clerk will swear. "I will press charges for trespass." "You pressed the sand on the ink yourself." The argument moved in quick shots. The survivor named the cipher aloud several times. The warden leaned over the ledger, fingers lifting the ink. He looked at the clerk. "Clerk," he said, "tell them." The clerk's throat worked. He spoke in a small voice. "You ordered the changes," he said. "You signed the margins to approve them." I followed orders. That admission widened the room's silence into a courtroom of candles. The climax peaked where the outline demanded it. Guards began to surround the archive table. The warden reached for the ledger as if to reclaim evidence, but the narrator, who had catalogued the ledger pages by name and date, shoved a stack of papers toward the hall where 2 town officials waited for routine sign-off. "He opened that door and send these to the magistrate. The signatures will be verified," the warden barked. He ordered the guards to seal the room, invent a new file trail, and to claim the archive had been tampered with. The survivor pushed a ledger open to a page where the warden's marginal cipher sat beside erased names and announced, "These are the names you erased." The warden's face broke into an expression that was not merely anger, but calculation. He tried to reassert control by rewriting the narrative on the spot. A twist arrived. The clerk produced a second ledger from his pocket and thrust it at a guard's face. "Here are the originals. The clerk said they were copied before they were revised. I swore to protect at least one set." The guard read the dates, then the guard's eyes flicked to the warden. For a breath the guard hesitated. His allegiance was not absolute. That unexpected refusal to obey without question altered the balance. The warden barked louder. "Detain him," he ordered. The guard with the copied ledger looked at the warden, and then at the open door where the magistrate could be summoned. He put his hand on the stack of original petitions and whispered. No, the word had the weight of a bell. Confrontation split the room. Guards who had been barely visible became actors with choices. Some obeyed the warden and moved to corral the papers. Others stood frozen. The narrator stepped forward and read names aloud, one by one, with dates and notes beside each petition. Each spoken name was an untying of the warden's cloak. Survivors on paper were returned to speech. The warden tried to fabricate a new trail. "These files are corrupt," he said. But the clerk and the narrator produced receipts and signatures that disproved his claim. The warden attempted a final procedural gambit. He sealed the room with a stamp and claimed chain of custody violations. He ordered the guard to take the survivor back to solitary. He signaled a clerk to sanitize adjacent files. For a moment it seemed he would succeed. The guard moved. The clerks bent their heads. Then the magistrate's footfall echoed in the corridor. A town official had been summoned as the narrator had planned. The magistrate entered, took in the spread of documents, and demanded an explanation. The warden's mask of authority frayed as his procedural language met legal inspection. The aftermath was brittle and incomplete. The magistrate ordered a temporary seal on the files and appointed an independent scribe to copy the disputed pages. The warden, stripped of unquestioned power in that room, offered a procedural compromise, a review committee. The narrator catalogued the exposed names, listing the petitions that would proceed to the magistrate. The survivor read aloud a name from the pile and pressed the token into the clerk's hand. "Keep this safe," he said. "Do not let them rewrite this one." The clerk nodded and placed the token inside a folded petition. The chapter closed with action rather than reflection. Guards moved people apart, officials recorded witness statements, and the warden sat, pale and composed, while the magistrate read aloud the ledger entries. The warden left the room under escort. His freedom to remake records had been narrowed, yet the narrator knew the system could reassert itself. He catalogued the exposed names and recorded each marginal cipher for a public ledger kept by the magistrate as scribe. The survivor watched the warden go and then turned his face to the lit window where dawn bled along high glass. A final, practical beat resolved the conflict. The magistrate issued orders to secure a copy of every petition and to place them under seal with a sworn witness. The clerk, who had taken risks, was given temporary protection pending inquiry. The warden, for now, retained his office but not his immunity. The narrator closed the ledger with a concrete motion and placed it beneath his arm. He did not say the word justice. He instead left the courthouse carrying the recorded names, the token tucked in the clerk's pocket, and the knowledge that records could be rewritten, but exposures could be multiplied. The chapter ends on a concrete action. The survivor walked to the solitary wing gate and banged the carved token against the iron until a guard answered. He spoke a single line to the guard. "Tell them I will not disappear from paper." The guard nodded, not from loyalty, but because the magistrate had commanded copies. The narrator followed with the ledger under his coat and the clerk trailing with a stack of original petitions. Outside, morning light hit damp stone. The archived door closed behind them with a solid, resonant thunk. That thunk was not an ending. It was an administrative sound, a closure of a room and the opening of an official file. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The ledger was unbound, some names returned, and an institutional promise to investigate had been forced into paper and witness. The rest, as the narrator recorded in his notes, would require persistence, oversight, and a willingness to name the names when the warden attempted to seal them again. Emotion shifts in this chapter registered in action: fear to suspicion to resolve in the survivor, suspicion to tactical escalation in the narrator, control to panic to legal defense in the warden. Those shifts happened through precise gestures: the survivor's hand on a token, the clerk slipping a copy into his coat, the narrator pushing pages into an official site. Each change of feeling produced an outward move. This chapter tied back to earlier moments. The iron bar shoved aside in the first ledger, the clerk's scraped line from chapter 2, the solitary door sweat creak. Those events reappeared as facts to build on rather than as atmospheric echoes. The ledger's marginal cipher that the warden used earlier was identified and read aloud, altering the warden's authority. The clerk's private copy, an act of quiet defiance first hinted at in the record's alcove, became decisive evidence. The survivor's carved token, first classed in Chapter 1, provided the physical link between paper and person. There is no neat moral closure. The warden retained his post and could still manipulate paperwork elsewhere, but the public record had been punctured. The magistrate's order ensured copies existed outside the wardenship's hands. The narrator recorded the names and returned the ledger to the magistrate's custody. The survivor returned to his cell under escort, but he took with him the knowledge that his name had been spoken aloud in a room of officials and recorded by a sworn scribe. A final practical detail anchors the ending. At dawn, the magistrate placed a wax seal over a new packet of petitions and handed one copy to the survivor through the grate of solitary. The survivor traced his name on that paper and felt the pressing of ink under his nail. He pressed the carved token into the clerk's hand and said, "Keep this with the originals." The clerk folded it into the packet and closed the book. The narrator left the courthouse with a list of names to be published in the town ledger, an action that could be verified and could not be unmade with an iron scrub of ink. The archive door closed behind them, the seal setting like a promise that would require constant attention. The final line is a situational beat. A magistrate's clerk knocks twice on the outer gate and orders a town crier to post the recovered names on the market board, making the erased visible in the public square. That act, ink transferred to public notice, was the concrete end of the chapter and the beginning of a long scrutiny that the warden could not perform alone.